A warm muffin on a cold street. The icy wind whipped through the narrow alleyways of the city, rattling old shop signs and stinging any skin left uncovered. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones like a restless ghost, and the few people on the streets hurried past with their heads down, eager to escape the bite of winter. Sophie tightened her thin jacket around her small frame, her hands red from the cold. Beside her, 8-year-old Evan skipped to keep warm, his worn sneakers slapping against the wet pavement. In his mittened hands, he clutched a paper bag that smelled faintly of blueberries and sugar. They had spent the night in a cramped shelter that smelled of disinfectant and old blankets. The previous evening, Sophie had used the last of her tips from waiting tables to buy Evan a muffin from a nearby bakery. It was stale now, slightly crushed from being carried around all morning, but to Evan, it was still treasure. "Can we split it, Mom?" Evan asked, glancing up at her with bright green eyes. Sophie forced a smile and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "No, honey. That's yours. I'm not hungry." Evan hesitated, but nodded. He carefully opened the bag, the warm aroma, a small comfort in the biting air. "Bad hen." As they turned the corner, Evan stopped suddenly. On the steps of a boarded-up bookstore sat a man hunched beneath a heavy coat, his face hidden by an overgrown beard and a wool hat pulled low. A battered guitar case lay at his feet, cracked open but empty. "Mom," Evan whispered, tugging her sleeve. "That man looks sad." Sophie barely glanced. "Don't stare, sweetheart." But Evan didn't move. He stood watching as the man rubbed his hands together, blowing into them for warmth. His clothes were ragged, his boots caked in mud. Something about the way he slumped forward made Evan's chest tighten. Before Sophie could stop him, Evan stepped forward. "Evan," she called, her voice sharp with worry. The boy walked slowly toward the man, clutching the muffin. When he stopped in front of him, the man's head lifted slightly, and his tired, hollow eyes met Evan's. "You look like you need this more than me," Evan said softly, holding out the muffin with both hands. The man blinked, stunned. His chapped lips parted, but no words came. He reached out with trembling fingers and took the offering as though it were made of gold. "Thank you," he croaked, his voice raspy from disuse. Sophie caught up just as Evan turned back to her. "I'm sorry, Mom," he murmured. "But he looked like he needed it." Sophie opened her mouth to scold him, then stopped. The man was staring at the muffin, a single tear sliding down his weathered cheek. She swallowed hard. "It's okay, Evan." As they walked away, the man remained frozen, the muffin still untouched in his hands. For the first time in months, warmth flickered in his chest, not from the food, but from the boy's words. The man's name was Caleb Hart, once a celebrated architect who had designed some of the city's most iconic buildings. But tragedy had stolen everything from him: his wife, his child, his will to create. He had become a ghost in the streets he once shaped. But the boy's kindness, so simple and unassuming, cracked something inside him. For the first time in years, he wondered if he might still be seen. And for the first time in years, he wondered if this wasn't the end of his story. The man who forgot how to dream. The muffin sat untouched in Caleb's hand long after the little boy and his mother had disappeared around the corner. The paper bag crinkled softly in the wind, its sweet aroma almost too much to bear. He stared at it like it was a relic from a life he no longer belonged to. For months, no, years now, Caleb had drifted through the streets of the city like a shadow. Once, people had known his name. His designs had graced the front pages of magazines, and clients had fought to have him create their dream buildings. But all of that ended the day he lost her. His wife, Clara, had been the one who believed in beauty, even when life was cruel. When cancer came like a thief in the night, she smiled through the pain, still encouraging him to sketch, to dream, to live. He hadn't listened. And when she slipped away in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the steady beep of machines and the faint smell of antiseptic, something inside him died too. Caleb left it all behind: the studio, the house with the sunlit kitchen Clara had loved, the colleagues who didn't know how to look at him anymore. He packed a single bag and walked out, no plan, no goodbye. Z. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Not until that boy. Z. You look like you need this more than me. Z. The words replayed in Caleb's mind over and over. How could a child see so clearly what he himself had buried so deep? That night, Caleb found himself in a rundown shelter, lying on a thin cot as snores and coughs echoed around the dim room. He held the muffin in his hands like it might vanish if he let go. Eventually, he ate it, slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as though it were sacred. As he chewed, he remembered Clara's last words, whispered through cracked lips. "You'll keep going, Caleb. Someone out there will need what you still have to give." At the time, he hadn't believed her. Now, for the first time in so long, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd been right. The next morning, Caleb returned to the same street corner where he'd first seen the boy and his mother. He didn't expect to find them, but he sat on the steps of the old bookstore anyway, his guitar case open beside him. Hours passed. Just as the afternoon sun began to sink behind the buildings, he saw them, Sophie and Evan, walking briskly, her hand clutching his little arm protectively. They didn't notice him as they passed, but Caleb's heart thudded in his chest. He wanted to call out, to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. Haste. So instead, he watched them disappear into the crowd. And for the first time in a long time, he stood up, not because he had anywhere to go, but because sitting still felt like giving up. Small steps towards the light. The days that followed were the coldest of the season. Frost clung stubbornly to every surface, and even the hardiest of street vendors had retreated indoors. But Caleb found himself walking the streets again, not to escape, not to disappear into the gray blur of the city, but searching. He didn't know what he was looking for until he saw them. Sophie was crouched by a convenience store window, scanning the corkboard of handwritten job postings while Evan clutched her coat. The boy's cheeks were pink from the cold, and his sneakers, still the same ones, were wet from melted snow. Caleb stayed across the street, hidden in the shadow of a bus shelter. He didn't approach. He couldn't. Not yet. That night, he walked the city with a paper bag in hand. Inside was a fresh muffin, still warm from the bakery's oven. He hadn't eaten all day, but somehow it didn't matter. When he finally found them, huddled beneath the overhang of a closed laundromat, he hesitated. Sophie's face was drawn and tired as she held Evan close. The boy's eyes were half closed, his head resting against her shoulder. Caleb stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the salted pavement. He set the bag down a few feet away and whispered, "For the boy." Sophie's head jerked up, startled. Her eyes narrowed at the shadowed figure. "Why?" she asked cautiously. But Caleb didn't answer. He was already retreating, his coat blending into the darkness. The next morning, Sophie found the bag. Evan's face lit up when he saw the muffin. "Mom! It's still warm." That smile. It stayed with Caleb all day, and so he did it again the next night. And the night after that, a granola bar, a carton of milk, a scarf. Each time, he left before Sophie could speak. But on the fourth night, as he placed a pair of mittens on the step where they slept, her voice stopped him cold. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb froze. Slowly, he turned. Sophie stood in the doorway of the building, her arms crossed tight, her breath curling in the icy air. "Are you following us?" she demanded. Her voice wasn't unkind, just weary. Caleb shook his head. "No. He swallowed hard. "I wanted to thank your boy." "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else did." Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the rawness in his voice. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "Fine," she said quietly, "but at least tell me your name if you're going to keep showing up." Caleb hesitated. It had been so long since he'd said it out loud. "Caleb." A thread of connection. Sophie wasn't sure why she let him linger. In another life, she might have told a stranger like Caleb to leave them alone, to stay far away from her and Evan. But there was something in his eyes that didn't feel threatening. just hollow, like a man who had already lost too much to take anything from anyone else. The next morning, as Sophie bundled Evan into his too-thin jacket, she saw Caleb sitting across the street on a bench, his guitar case at his feet. He didn't approach, didn't wave, just sat quietly, watching the pigeons peck at crumbs. For the first time, she didn't pull Evan close and hurry away. A few days later, Sophie was struggling with 2 heavy grocery bags while Evan tugged at her hand, asking endless questions about snowmen. She nearly dropped one bag when a voice spoke softly behind her. "Here, let me help." She turned to see Caleb, his hands outstretched. Sophie hesitated, her instinct to refuse clashing with the deep ache in her arms. Finally, she let him take a bag. "Thank you," she murmured. They walked in silence for a while. Caleb didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. Estams. When they reached the small room Sophie rented by the week, he set the bag down at the door and stepped back. "Good night," he said simply. But before he could leave, Evan's voice piped up. "Do you play the guitar?" Caleb blinked. "I used to. Can you teach me?" Sophie started to protest, but Evan's hopeful eyes made her pause. "Maybe another time," Caleb said gently, meeting Sophie's gaze. She gave the faintest nod. That night, as Sophie tucked Evan into bed, he whispered, "He's sad, Mommy, like really sad." Sophie brushed his hair back. "I know, sweetheart. Can we help him smile?" Her throat tightened. "We'll see." The following Saturday, Sophie found Caleb at the library, reading a battered book of architecture sketches. "You're an architect?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled. "I was." "Before?" "Yes." They didn't speak of it further, but Sophie noticed how his fingers lingered on the pages, tracing the lines of buildings like old memories. Over time, Caleb became a quiet presence in their lives. He never imposed, never stayed too long. Sometimes he sat on the park bench, just close enough for Evan to wave and yell, "Hi, Mr. Caleb." One snowy afternoon, he surprised them both with a paper bag of warm pastries. "Peace offering," he said when Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Why?" she asked. "Because your boy reminded me that kindness still exists." Sophie studied him for a long moment. "You know," she said softly, "he sees the world like it's still full of good things. I don't want him to lose that." Caleb's voice was low. "Neither do I. How are you feeling about the story so far? I'd really love to know what you think. Did it touch your heart or maybe remind you of something from your own life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're at it, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? I'd love to see how far this story travels." Healing over shared moments. The snow kept falling, blanketing the city in silence. It was the kind of hush that made even the loudest streets seem peaceful. Caleb sat on the park bench, strumming his old guitar softly. The strings were slightly out of tune, but the melody floated gently in the cold air like a fragile thread tying him to the world. Evan's voice cut through the stillness. "Can you play something happy?" Caleb looked up to see the boy standing a few feet away, his cheeks red from the cold, his mittened hands clutching a worn library book. "I can try," Caleb replied with a small smile. "What do you want to hear?" Evan shuffled closer, holding out the book. "It's about space. Can you make up a song about astronauts?" Caleb blinked. "Astronauts, huh? That's a challenge." He strummed a few chords, then began singing softly about rockets, stars, and brave explorers flying past Saturn's rings. Evan giggled, clapping his hands as Caleb added silly sound effects. Sophie stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching them with a guarded expression. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when she had stopped seeing Caleb as a stranger and started seeing him as something else. That evening, as they huddled in their small rented room, Caleb knocked softly on the door. "I brought something," he said, holding up a bag. Inside were 2 steaming cups of cocoa and a small box of cookies. "You didn't have to," Sophie said quietly. "I wanted to," Caleb replied. Evan squealed with delight. "Can we share with Mr. Caleb?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before nodding. They sat together on the worn carpet, sipping cocoa and laughing, as Evan told them stories about aliens and secret space missions. Caleb listened intently, asking questions and nodding like every word mattered. When Evan finally grew sleepy, Sophie tucked him into the thin mattress in the corner. "You're good with him," she murmured when she returned. Caleb's smile was faint. "He reminds me of how I used to be, before I forgot how to dream." Sophie studied him. "You don't seem like the kind of man who gives up easily." "I wasn't," Caleb admitted. "But losing everything changes you." Sophie didn't push for details. Instead, she offered a quiet truth of her own. "Evan's dad left when I was 3 months pregnant. Said he wasn't ready. I've been holding us together ever since, with duct tape and prayers." Caleb's chest tightened. "You're stronger than I am." "No," Sophie said softly. "I'm just stubborn." For the first time in months, Caleb let out a real laugh. And in that tiny, cold room, something began to thaw. Not just the winter outside, but the deep freeze around both their hearts. The return to the forgotten studio. The winter sun filtered weakly through the dirty windows of Caleb's old studio. Dust motes danced in the pale light, and the air smelled faintly of paper and forgotten dreams. It had been nearly 2 years since he last set foot in this place. The drafting table still sat in the corner, its surface covered in curled sketches and broken pencils. His old leather chair creaked in protest as he pulled it out and sank down. Caleb stared at a blank sheet of paper for a long time. His fingers hovered over the pencil, hesitant. Could he really do this again? "You'll keep going, Caleb, because someone out there will need what you still have to give." Clara's voice echoed softly in his mind. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to draw. At first, the lines were shaky, but as the hours passed, his hand steadied. Shapes took form: arches, windows, staircases, spiraling like galaxies. The sketch wasn't perfect, but it was alive. For the first time in what felt like forever, Caleb felt alive too. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie tucked Evan into bed. "Do you think Mr. Caleb will come tomorrow?" the boy asked, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Maybe," Sophie said, brushing his hair back. "I like it when he's here," Evan murmured. "He feels safe, like a big tree you can hide under when it rains." Sophie smiled faintly. "Good night, sweetheart." But later, as she sat alone on the couch, her mind wandered. She had seen something change in Caleb over the past few weeks. The way he stood a little taller, the way his eyes had begun to hold a faint spark again. He wasn't just helping them. Somehow they were helping him too. The next afternoon, as Sophie walked Evan home from school, they found Caleb waiting by the library steps with a paper bag in hand. "What's that?" Evan asked eagerly. Caleb knelt and opened the bag, revealing 3 steaming pastries. "I thought we could share." Evan clapped his hands in delight. "You're the best, Uncle Caleb." Caleb froze. It was the first time Evan had called him that. Sophie saw the flicker of emotion cross his face and said softly, "Looks like you've been promoted." Caleb's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "It's an honor." As they sat together on the steps, sharing pastries and watching the snowflakes drift down, Sophie noticed how natural it felt, like they'd done this 100 times before. She still didn't know Caleb's full story, but she knew one thing for sure. He was no longer a ghost. A place called home. The small rented room was colder than usual that night. The heater groaned weakly, struggling against the biting wind that rattled the thin window panes. Sophie sat at the tiny kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea. Evan was asleep in the corner, bundled in 2 sweaters and clutching his stuffed bear. A soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it cautiously to find Caleb standing there, snow clinging to his coat and hair. In his arms was a large brown bag. "What's this?" Sophie asked, eyeing him warily. He shifted awkwardly. I thought you could use some extra blankets. And food." Sophie hesitated. "Caleb, you don't have to keep doing this. We'll manage." "It's not charity," Caleb said gently. "It's because I care. For Evan. And for you." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Sophie studied him, seeing the raw honesty in his tired eyes. Slowly, she stepped aside to let him in. That night, as Evan snored softly in the corner, Sophie and Caleb sat across from each other at the table. "You're different now," Sophie murmured. Caleb looked down at his hands. "Because of him. Because of you." "I don't understand," she said softly. He drew a deep breath. "I lost my wife 2 years ago. After she died, I stopped caring about everything. I walked out of my life, my work, my home. I thought I was finished." Sophie's eyes softened. "And then Evan gave me a muffin," Caleb continued, a faint, shaky smile on his lips. "It shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. It reminded me. I'm still here." Sophie didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Maybe we both needed someone to remind us." Caleb's chest tightened. He didn't pull away. A week later, Sophie returned from a shift at the diner to find Caleb and Evan crouched on the living room floor, building a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes. "Mom! Uncle Caleb says we can go to space if we believe hard enough," Evan shouted, his face alight with joy. Sophie's heart swelled. Later that evening, as Evan slept, Caleb turned to Sophie. "I have a place. It's warm, safe. I thought maybe you and Evan could stay there, just until you get back on your feet." Sophie shook her head immediately. "We can't accept that. It's too much." "It's not much," Caleb said quietly. "It's just a roof. For a boy who deserves to sleep without shivering. And for a mother who deserves a moment to breathe." Sophie's breath caught. She thought of Evan curled up on the thin mattress, coughing in his sleep. "Okay," she whispered. And just like that, something shifted. The next morning, Caleb unlocked the door to a small, sunlit apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, clean, safe. Evan raced through the rooms, squealing with delight. Sophie stood in the doorway, clutching her coat tightly around her. "Why are you really doing this, Caleb?" she asked softly. He met her gaze steadily. "Because for the first time in years," he said, "I want to stay, where kindness grows." The spring sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the small apartment, painting the floor in soft gold. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and warm bread. Caleb had just taken a fresh tray of cookies out of the oven. Evan sat cross-legged on the floor, his crayons scattered around him like confetti. He hummed softly as he drew, his tongue peeking out in concentration. "Done!" he shouted suddenly, holding up his creation. Sophie leaned over from the couch, folding laundry. "Let me see, sweetheart." The paper was covered in bold, vibrant colors. 3 smiling figures standing beneath a bright blue sky, cookies raining down like blessings from the clouds. Above them, in wobbly child handwriting, were the words, "Me, Mommy, and Uncle Caleb, our happy home." Caleb froze when Evan handed him the drawing. His throat tightened. "You like it?" Evan asked, eyes wide with hope. Caleb's voice was hoarse. "I love it. It's perfect." Sophie walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "He sees you as family," she said quietly. Caleb looked up at her, his eyes shimmering. "I'm not trying to take anyone's place," he murmured. "But I want to stay. Not because you need me, not because I feel guilty, but because for the first time in years, I've found something worth staying for." Sophie's lips curved into a small, tender smile. "And maybe for the first time in years, I'm ready to let someone in." Caleb reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. Across the room, Evan beamed. "Are we going to be a team forever?" Caleb laughed softly. "Yeah, buddy, forever." As the radio played an old love song, and the scent of cookies filled the air, the 3 of them sat together in the warm kitchen. Then, no boardrooms, no penthouses, no applause. Azza, just a boy with a bright imagination, a mother who never stopped fighting, and a man who finally found home, not in bricks and beams, but in 2 hearts that had chosen him. Sometimes, family isn't what you're born into, it's what you build, and all it takes to start is one small act of kindness. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.